How many children were involved in or affected by family court judgments in the 2010 to 2015 period?
I'd have to take that on notice. I've got no idea.
Okay, thank you.
And I'm not even sure that we could provide an answer easily either. I mean, I'm just imagining the complexities of trying to extract that data from our database might be extremely difficult.
Okay.
For that period of time, that's a long period of time to a number of children impacted, and because they're impacted in a number of ways. There are interim orders, of which there are about 25,000 a year. There are application for final orders, which are about 20,000. There are other sorts of orders as well that impact on children across the board. So it's a very wide question, and we deal with about 200,000 individuals in a year, excluding children. So it'll be a very large number, but I've got no idea how we'll find that number out, but we'll do the best we can.
Senator Madigan, you obviously have a purpose for asking the question, but is there any way you could perhaps confine or narrow the thing? Because from what the CEO says, they're going to spend the rest of their days trying to find
there are 40,000 divorce orders as well, and about, I'm not sure how many, 13,000 consent orders. So we're talking about huge numbers of applications.
Anyhow, it stands, it's been taken on notice, but I can't imagine...
I'm not sure that we can actually answer the question.
Well, neither do I, but that's why I'm just suggesting you might want to try and confine your question to a more manageable thing that might get you an answer. It's up to you, of course, but I'm trying to be helpful.
Well, my questions pertain to, does the family court keep statistics on the effects of the court on children?
That's more of a research project, I think, Senator, not...
Well,
I mean, the court makes an order, but like any other court in the land, there's judges have no report back about what's the impact of their order. It works in the criminal jurisdiction, in family law. They make an order, and unless that matter's brought back before the court, they will have nothing further to do with that particular matter. So in terms of whether it's a positive or negative outcome, they would probably never know.
So I'd be right in assuming then that you'd have no statistics about how many of these children don't have substantial ongoing contact with one parent according to court orders then either.
Well, they also vary so much, Senator. I mean, there can be an interim order made for children who are 2 or 3 years old. 5 years down the track, when they come 8 or 9 years old, there's another order made, and those orders are changed, different contact or time with rules change. So, no, we don't have specific data on how much time individual children would spend with different parents.
Does the family court have any information of if court orders were adhered to, the welfare of those children consequent to court decisions? Do you do any follow-up to see what's happening?
Well, we only know about orders that have breached, that's all.
Sometimes orders are made for the family consultant to explain the orders to the children.
Yeah.
Senator, in some matters, the court does make an order that the family consultant meet with the children to explain the orders and the reasons that the judge made those orders. But unless the judge has made an order requiring either the family consultant to continue to maintain their relationship with the family, or ensure that the independent children's lawyer continues for a period of time rather than being discharged upon the order, the court has very little further to do with that family unless there's been a non-compliance with an order.
Right, so you can't give me, there's no figures on whether court orders were adhered to?
We would, Senator, have details in relation to applications for enforcement,
right?
if those applications are brought. we certainly would have that detail.
Would you be able to supply that to the committee on notice?
We can do that.
Yes, taken on notice.
Okay. Has the department, the court, got any data, or have you collected any data on the numbers of children that have attempted self-harm or suicide or experienced serious mental health disorders or conditions subsequent to family court interventions?
No, Senator. And these are probably matters I think that would be subject to some sort of significant research project. I don't know that it's a role of the court to do this sort of research. These questions that you're asking have significant resource implications to try and provide an answer, but I think we don't have a database that would tell us that. It'd be a manual examination of files and following up with the particular families in some way. So it'd be a significant research project, I would think.
So the department has no interest into the effects of its intervention?
The court obviously hopes that the orders that it make are effective and work, but with the amount of work that the courts do, there is no capacity for them to call the families back and say, how are you going? So once the order's been made, then the judge would have no more relationships or contact with that family, as neither does the administration of the court.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Senator.
Firstly, let me just point out the fact that the family courts are reluctant to enforce contact orders as it involves punishing the resident parent, the mother in the vast majority of cases, by means of a fine, a community order or imprisonment, which would then negatively impact upon the child or children. Despite clear warnings being attached to written contact orders stating the consequences for breaches are never enforced. Mothers know this, so they repeatedly breach contact orders without any repercussions on themselves. But the effects on children, fathers, and wider society are plain to see. There are no follow-ups to family court proceedings to assess the welfare of children, because the family courts aren't about the best interests of the child. They're about making money through the prolonged separation of children from their dads. Lawyers openly admit to writing unnecessary letters, causing friction between parents who are already at each other's throats over custody and other relationship issues. So-called expert family law firms draw these cases out for years so they can extract every penny from the fathers, who, far from being deadbeats, are the ones who actually finance the corrupt family courts globally. The Australian family law industry is a multi-billion-dollar business interest to all involved, and it's being financed by taxpayers and the fathers who just want to raise their own kids. Diana Bryant, Chief Justice of the Australian Family Law Court, applied for additional funding last year and secured an extra $22.5 million for court registrars. She claimed that the family court system is, quote, underfunded and letting people down. In a contradictory statement, Wendy Kaler-Thompson from the Law Council of Australia said the inability of the courts to provide timely access to justice was causing people to give up or settle for outcomes that were not in their interests or those of their children. Thompson said, I've been practicing family law for 25 years and I have never seen the resourcing of our family law system in such a state of crisis. Ms. Thompson goes on to say, one of the problems is that almost a third of people who move through the system represent themselves. We have a system clogged up by people who are representing themselves. Despite Ms. Thompson's claims, one father said it took him almost 3 years to get a family order, giving him access to his children after his separation. But on his third access visit, the children never arrived. That was a year ago, and he hasn't seen them since. He said the police would not get involved, and his only option was to go back to the courts. He said he'd spent almost $100,000 going through the process the first time, and has since been diagnosed with depression. He said, I just don't think I can mentally go through another year or 2 or 3 or whatever it's going to take to see the kids. He goes on to say, "To go back into the system again, I just don't know whether I can handle it." The family court system is to blame for the prolonged separation of children from their dads, and Wendy Kayla Thompson knows this. I can tell you from my own personal experiences, as litigant in person, representing myself in the UK family courts, that child custody cases come to a conclusion in a fraction of the time when the fathers represent themselves. I wasted 2.5 years dealing with solicitors who got me nowhere. It was only when I began to represent myself that contact orders were made. No dad in his right mind would seek to prolong his own court proceedings. They choose to represent themselves because they're sick of the long, drawn-out court process, and they're sick of corrupt lawyers bleeding them dry financially. I've also met men who've spent tens of thousands on court fees and legal fees, even losing their houses in some cases because they weren't confident enough or able to represent themselves. The family court systems the world over are about making money, which prolongs the separation of children from their dads, in turn allowing the resident mothers years to further alienate the children from their dads, poisoning their minds and abusing their own children, because these women simply hate the father more than they love their own children. These women have been allowed to abuse the power and control handed to them, using their own children as meal tickets and weapons without any accountability for the consequences. We need to teach women not to alienate and punish them when they do. Women have not been socialized or conditioned to act this way, as some people have suggested. Female nature has been well documented for thousands of years, long before feminism ever reared its ugly head. These deadbeat mothers are choosing to abuse their own kids and destroy the lives of the fathers. The family courts merely enable this innate female behaviour. Bringing these cases to a swift conclusion would prevent the family law system from profiting directly with additional court and legal fees for subsequent interim orders and enforcement applications. Non-compliance has to be paid for by the non-resident fathers. Applications for enforcement are not a clear indicator of compliance either. They won't yield accurate data on breaches of contact orders because so many dads just give up on ever seeing their kids again because of parental alienation or financial ruin brought about by extortionate and unnecessary legal fees. Prolonged and drawn-out court cases actually enable parental alienation. There's also no need to begin a, quote, significant research project to gather quantitative data on self-harm and suicide in children, as the Australian child suicide stats are already well documented up to and including the year 2015. A total number of 494 children between the ages of 5 to 17 years successfully committed suicide from 2010 to 2015. That's roughly one child suicide every 4 days in Australia, and those are just the deaths recorded as suicides. Many child suicides will be recorded as accidental deaths. A simple and inexpensive inquiry into the family backgrounds of these children and a study of suicide notes left would give us enough qualitative evidence to provide accurate stats on the causes of child suicides in Australia or any other country. Family breakups lead to the separation of children from their fathers in around 85% of all family custody battles in the UK alone, according to ONS statistics, consistently for the past 20 years. One can only hazard a guess as to the amount of damage done to children and wider societies that allow the removal of dads from the lives of children during the critical years of early development. The act of parental alienation does, by law, constitute 2 criminal offences: child abuse and coercive control. Coercive control carries a maximum 5-year prison sentence. Child abuse sentencing, depending on duration and severity, ranges from 3 months in prison to 26 weeks, with new UK legislation proposing a maximum 10-year sentence for parents who subject their children to emotional cruelty. Coercive control laws do not apply to minors, but they are applicable in intimate partner relationships when one partner isolates the other from their friends and family, or willfully obstructs contact between their partner and his family members. as the percentage of mothers being given custody in family courts is approximately 85%, again statistically backed up by government agencies worldwide. It's only fair that we focus on the separation of children from their dads. That's not to say that men don't also alienate children from their mothers, but it's nowhere near as prevalent as the reverse, which is why I strongly suspect the politicians and police are so willing to overlook cases of abuse, neglect and coercive control when a woman is committing these criminal acts. The act of parental alienation forces both the child and the father to grieve for the loss of their family member. Both the media and politicians have systematically dismissed and ridiculed fathers and fathers' rights groups for speaking out, which has led to further refusals when the subject of parental alienation or any other men's issues is raised for debate.
Right, Philip. An application about International Men's Day.
Yes, indeed, Mr. Chairman. My pitch is a fairly straightforward one, in the sense that every year since I can remember, certainly since I've been a member of this House, which is 10 years now, we've had an annual debate, and in the last few years, this committee has granted one. In fact, I think I was on the committee when it did grant the debate for International Women's Day. And that's been held every single year. And so I thought that in the spirit of gender equality, it would only be right to have a debate to commemorate International Men's Day, which conveniently falls on Thursday the 19th of November, which is a date when you may or may not have some time to allocate, so it will be very fitting. Because, of course, not only do we have International Women's Day, we also have women and equality questions every month in the Chamber, which we don't have for men. So the opportunity for men to raise issues that are important to them is very limited. And just to give you a flavour, Mr. Chairman, of the type of things that may come up and which will be part of International Men's Day, I'm not entirely sure why it's so humorous, but to discuss issues such as men's shorter life expectancy, wider male health issues, many of which go unreported through embarrassment of men to sort of go along and talk about these things, the high suicide rate amongst men, the propensity for violence against men. There's many male victims of domestic violence, again, as something that goes very much unreported because of lots of embarrassment about it. The underachievement of boys in education compared to girls, the issues around father-child relationships, and often the way that fathers sometimes feel they don't get a fair crack of the whip in terms of custody of their children and things like that. These are all issues that affect an awful lot of people around the country, whether people agree with some people's views or not. I think it's important that the House of Commons debates these issues. I think people can recognise that they are all very real issues for many people in the country. And so in the spirit of gender equality, given that we have the debate each year on International Women's Day, which I suspect will continue under this committee, I thought it would only be fair that we had an opportunity to debate these issues under the flag of International Men's Day, which is this year on Thursday the 19th of November.
Thank you very much. Questions? Jess?
You have to excuse me for laughing, that the idea that men don't have the opportunity to ask questions in this place is a frankly laughable thing. As I say, as the only woman on this committee, it seems like every day to me is.
Well, I wasn't making, with respect, I wasn't making that point. I wasn't making the point that men don't have an opportunity to ask. I was about men's issues. There's a very big difference between men raising issues and the raising of men's issues.
But one could raise men's issues in any single one of the question sessions. So your men's health, absolutely. So prostate cancer, that could be raised in men's questions, couldn't it?
Well,
that could be
Mr. Chairman, I very much look forward to these arguments being deployed when we come to consider a debate on International Women's Day, because exactly the same arguments could be raised for International Women's Day, that women's health issues, that equality issues could be raised in women and equality questions in other forms. So all I ask is for an equal crack of the whip, that if those issues can be raised without having a debate on International Men's Day, then obviously the same issues can apply for when it comes to International Women's Day, but those arguments have never won the day before this committee.
I just think that it's worth pointing out the idea that this chamber, that these houses, both of them, in any way reflect gender equality is to me a frankly laughable thing. And so in the fight for equality, I'm not sure the men on this list necessarily have that much to fight for.
Right. Bob, please.
Well, it's a very interesting proposition, but it's not one we've taken up with anyone else so far.
We don't know whether it will be offered to 19th, to be fair.
I don't care about men's issues. It's that I'm hoping for parity myself.
Hear, hear.
I absolutely care about men's issues. And when I've got parity, and when women in these buildings have parity, you can have your debate.
Oh, Mr. Chairman, if I can just make the point,
And that will take an awfully long time.
I'm not requesting a debate on representation within the House of Commons. I'm asking for debates on men's issues, and the list of issues I gave earlier, I would like to think people can recognise are genuine issues and actually are very, very rarely debated in the House of Commons. Very rarely debated in the House of Commons.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Philip. Thank you very much indeed. We will obviously have a discussion, as you know, I'm a previous member of the committee, about taking that forward. But I would honestly say that for us to properly consider your application, it really does need to be backed up with
With radical feminists like Jess Phillips being allowed to express anti-male views in Parliament, and other spineless male ministers who capitulate and refuse to acknowledge male issues, which affect both men and their children, there's no change in sight. You can hear the contempt for men in Jess Phillips' voice, and her body language clearly indicates her need to shut down any debate surrounding men's issues. She uses the fallacy of gender inequality to excuse her blatant misandry. The UK government recently set aside 20 million for violence against women and girls, despite the fact that violence against girls is just as likely to be committed by a woman, more specifically her own mother, and that's if she hasn't already chosen to abort the child. The hypocrisy is unbelievable and far too extensive for me to cover in just one video. Jess Phillips has the audacity to demand parity when there's an additional £20 million budgeted for violence against women and girls, but nothing is allocated for boys or men, not one penny. Jess Phillips wants parity when the suicide rate for boys is double that of girls, and male suicides have now reached epidemic levels according to the NHS. Jess Phillips has done irreparable damage to the lives of children and their dads, and their extended families. Insane women like her enable child suicides and the abuse of children because the biological father has been forced out of their lives. Child Protective Services report that both male and female children are at an increased risk of physical and sexual abuse, as well as neglect and emotional abuse when their biological father has been made absent or has been replaced with another man. It kind of goes against the whole violence against women and girls agenda now, doesn't it? So why does the state support the forced separation of children from their fathers? Well, it might have something to do with the billions of dollars the Australian family courts rake in every year, or the billions of pounds the UK family child abuse courts and coercive control courts rake in annually, or the billions of dollars the US family kidnap and murder courts rake in every year, all with the help of corrupt judges, gender-biased politicians and unethical lawyers who seek to extract the maximum amount of money possible from the fathers who pay for it all. Yet they have the nerve to label non-resident fathers deadbeat dads, despite the billions of pounds and dollars they sacrifice fighting just to be able to raise their own kids. It fucking stinks. The whole thing stinks of corruption, and the lawyers, the judges, the politicians have all got the blood of these children on their hands. Women like Jess Phillips and other feminist sympathisers enable state-sanctioned kidnap and murder, and the spineless men in governments who capitulate and kowtow so as not to be seen to be sexist or misogynistic. All of them are responsible. They've all got the blood of innocent children on their hands. They all enable and overlook the psychotic side of female nature, which allows these women to be so callous and sadistic. Just look at men like Evan Stark, for instance. So biased against his own gender, it's no wonder they've chosen to reference him in White Ribbon Campaign research documents. It's nothing more than confirmation bias. It's not research. So let's all hear what Evan Stark has to say about coercive control.
nothing I am going to say is meant to in any way discount the incredible achievements many of you, if not all of you, have contributed to. We've circled the globe with our movement to end partner abuse. Last year, we probably served close to 1 billion women and children worldwide. We've saved countless lives, and we've certainly improved and ameliorated the suffering of countless thousands of women. So we'll talk about the dynamics of coercive control, what it means to identify coercive control not as a crime of assault, not as a crime against women's bodies, but as a crime against women's liberties and rights. Each of us meets someone in this business that stays with us and becomes for us who everyone else is. And once we get that lesson, we can't unlearn it. When the first woman and her 9-year-old daughter hid in our house before we had shelters of refugees, and all I understood was, because of the physical injuries that she presented when she came to us, was to ask her about the violence. And I had been working with survivors of rape, and so when she said violence wasn't the worst part, and it would be another 20 years before I really began to understand what that woman had meant when she told me violence wasn't the worst part. And Deela shoots her husband 4 times, point-blank range. She takes the gun that he's had under the pillow, shoots him 4 times at point-blank range in the head, then goes downstairs, calls the police, and comes back upstairs to get the gun. And this is what the police officer wrote about Deela when she got to the station. Mrs. Bayless described her husband as a very complex person. She stated that he had always demanded from her an exact outline of how she spent her day. She said she would have to prepare a summary of meals planned for the month for his approval. She said, quote, he was never happy with macaroni or steak or potatoes, but instead demanded meals such as veal marsala. Nothing she did would ever please him, she said. Nothing was ever good enough to meet his demands. She relayed one incident which prompted a beating, explaining that they had bought their house about 1 year ago. He once asked her to tell him what they needed for the house. She said she began to name some things, nothing specific named. And he asked her if she thought shades were important. She replied, yes, they were important too. He then demanded to know why she hadn't thought of them herself, why she wasn't caring enough. And then he began to beat her. So, I mean, while the beating is there were no police reports of prior incidents. All I had in that case was one medical visit for a broken thumb, which her husband had broken by slamming the car door on it, but there was no evidence of this in the medical record. I was able to document numerous minor assaults, non-injurious assaults, just from the interview and some contemporary records she came. But this puzzled the officer. Why would somebody who killed her husband talk about veal marsala and menus on the way down to the station? What was going on here? And the prosecutor, after interviewing Deela, heard her she told the prosecutor, look, you know, every night he would have his way with me. We would have sex every night. But that night that she killed him, she told the prosecutor, we went to bed without sex. And so the prosecutor's theory in that case was that this was a woman spawned. In other words, she killed him because there was no sex, she wanted sex, and that was it.
Pathetic men like Evan Stark are to blame for the suicides of these children. because he's too weak to call out obstructive mothers on their coercive control in keeping family members apart from each other. Let's hear what Evan Stark has to say about the effects of coercive control on the victims. He has the audacity to accuse men of kidnap and domestic terrorism in the title of this video.
But in the 60% of the cases where I believe the pattern of violence is complemented by this extended pattern of intimidation, isolation, and control, I believe a much more broad-based and fundamental crime needs to be identified and we need to enforce it. I think that with the 60% of battering cases that comprise domestic violence, I think we need a law that punishes offenders at the same level that we would punish people who take hostages or kidnap people, because what we're really dealing with, although the analogy is by no means perfect, is a kind of domestic terrorism, a kind of domestic hostage-taking in which the victim has no outside to escape to, because the supposed safe place, the relationship, the home, the family network, has been identified as the point of imprisonment and entrapment. So I think that while we can deal with some proportion of cases simply by reforming our current domestic violence laws and enforcing them more carefully by looking at the pattern of behavior as part of the crime rather than as recidivism or as a repeat of a single crime, I think we need a fundamentally new criminal justice approach, and beyond that, a new social service approach to the liberty crime of coercive control.
Well, you don't say, Evan. Now you just need to apply that rationale to the children who end up siding with their abusive mothers and rejecting their fathers. Parental alienation and false allegations of sexual abuse make sure that some of these dads will never see their kids again. These children often develop Stockholm Syndrome, believing that the mother, who is abusing and controlling them, is the only parent who can protect them. These children have already lost one parent, their dad, so they cling to the abusive mother for fear of losing that one remaining parent. During my time spent representing myself in the UK family courts, it became clear that the term parental alienation was not recognised in legal terms. Instead, the terms obstruction or coaching were to be used. Alienating a father from his child or children is coercive control and child abuse. It's hostage-taking, which inevitably leads to Stockholm Syndrome. The child sides with the abusive mother just to survive, while at the same time rejecting their own father. Evan Stark, you've got the blood of innocent children on your fucking hands. So what happens when parental alienation is made a criminal offence? Well, it was made a criminal offence in Brazil in 2010. All instances of alienation, including making false allegations of abuse, taking children out of the jurisdiction to make visitation harder, withholding medical or legal information about children from their fathers, and any other sustained campaign of alienation is now punishable by law in Brazil, possibly leading to the removal of children from the mother's care, or lack of it, to be replaced by the biological father, and rightly so. Why are other countries not following this example and actively enforcing parental alienation laws? Environmental stressors such as family breakdown, emotional neglect, physical and sexual abuse during childhood have been cited as some of the causes of child suicides, all of these being directly related to parental alienation. Brazil has shown a steady decline in suicide attempts over recent years, but there are far too many variables for us to draw any correlations between this decline and the implementation of parental alienation laws. The new laws would have to be used in all cases of alienation for there to be a significant effect, and I can find no evidence of these laws being enforced. As with the enforcement of breaches in defined contact orders and the court's reluctance to punish custodial mothers, I suspect the same is true in Brazil when it comes to securing convictions against mothers who alienate children from their dads. Hardly surprising when we have radical feminists in government and spineless men who acquiesce when the subject of men's issues is raised. When will they ever see the direct links between the inequalities suffered by dads in the family courts and the emotional suffering in children, which damages wider society and inevitably leads to many forms of self-harm in children and men, often leaving them with no option but to end their own suffering?